For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me for Suttner's View, a weekly commentary on South Africa's political scene. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Morning.
What were traditional leaders' place historically and under apartheid?
Traditional leaders or chiefs and kings have had a different role, different stages of history. In the early period of white attempts to conquer and actual conquest of African people, chiefs and kings often were at the forefront of resistance. Someone like Sekhukhune, for example, in the 19th century, up in the Limpopo province, resisted the Boer Republic of the South African Republic, as it was called, for decades. Cetshwayo defeated the British at Isandlwana. On the Eastern Cape frontier, for 100 years, there was warfare, resistance from a number of different Xhosa-speaking people. And in most cases, the chiefs were in the forefront, although some of them did collaborate. There was a split amongst the Khakhabe, for example, because what the British tried to do often is to offer something to some people, and was very often the Christian converts or the Mfengu and other people, and they would fight alongside the British. But when people talk about the history of resistance, they usually start at Dingane, Sekhukhune, Bambata, a number of chiefs. Makhanda is not an actual chief, he was a prophet. But so they had that role. When the ANC was formed, there was a sense that the chiefs were part of the resistance, and they had a house of chiefs in the beginning of the ANC. And at first, the chiefs used to help fund the ANC because they thought somehow the ANC would strengthen them. But over the decades that followed, chiefs wavered, and chiefs and kings wavered in their support. When the Nationalist Party government came to power, well, even before they came to power, through the way in which the chieftainship was viewed by the Union government and the later apartheid governments, the chiefs became paid officials of the government. That didn't mean that they all became lackeys of the government, but many of them, when they didn't like what these chiefs were doing, they would just dismiss them. So that the line, the lineage of who should be chief got interrupted, but much more so during apartheid. Many chiefs were thrown out during the Bantu Authorities Act, the Bantustans, all these things. So chiefs have got a mixed record, especially during the Bantustan period, when some of them collaborated very closely with the apartheid regime. Many of them are now still treated as respectable individuals in the present, but if you look at their record, it's not so good.
If we look at the Constitution, what is their status?
The Constitution recognizes the institution of traditional leaders and customary law subject to the provisions of the Constitution. In other words, they are not royalty of a feudal kind who can just do what they like because they are born to rule. They are born to rule if they have in fact come from the royal line. They are ruling insofar as they have spheres where they have been given powers, but in a democratic state. In other words, at the local level where they are, there is local government which is democratically elected. There's a Bill of Rights which says you cannot do certain things. You cannot practice certain customs potentially. Some customs have already been questioned in the courts and thrown out as being unconstitutional. But the traditional leaders themselves sometimes claim rights which may be out of line with the Constitution. But they are recognized constitutionally, and personally I believe if people respect chiefs and kings as their leaders, we must respect that and allow that, but engage with them over certain practices which may be unconstitutional or undemocratic.
We know now that the hot topic in our country is the issue of land. What do these traditional leaders have to do with the land question, and do they have any special rights or privileges?
Well, you know, the land area where chiefs are located, insofar as they have land which is attributed to a community, their powers are those traditionally of trusteeship, that they hold land on behalf of the people, and the people must have access to that land, and a lot of people are now asking to have title to that land in their own rights and to build, do what they want to do on that. It's not owned by the chiefs. It's not the land of King Goodwill Zwelithini, nor is it the land of any other chief. But there was this deal made on the eve of the elections between the apartheid regime in Carter and the king, which created the Ingonyama Trust, which now owns 30% of the land in KwaZulu-Natal. And people who are inhabitants of these areas, some of whom had never fallen under the Zulu kingdom, people who are inhabiting these lands are now being forced to pay rent, and I think it's something like 60 million rand was collected last year in rent, and some of them are falling behind, and so that these things are probably open to question constitutionally in the present situation.
And what do we make of the recent ANC reaction to King Goodwill Zwelithini's threats over Ingonyama Trust?
You see, what I think is important is the Ingonyama Trust is not the same question as how the ANC and the government should be dealing with expropriation with or without compensation, because that's a question which relates to how you interpret the right to acquire property under Section 25 of the Constitution. Do you need to amend it, or are there powers in that section which are sufficient to acquire land from people? And the argument of many people is that for 22 years, 24 years, the government has had this power and has never tested it. They brought in this concept of willing seller, willing buyer, and there was always a power to expropriate under particular conditions. They never tested whether an expropriation on equitable grounds will be taken to court and things like that. Ingonyama is a completely different, not completely different, but it's a very different thing, because that's not land which people want to expropriate per se. It's the rights over the land which people are asking, why is it that the king and the Ingonyama Trust board, or whatever they're called, that they are claiming certain things. That is a separate thing. Now the ANC, when the king, I may be anticipating what you're going to ask me later, but when the king threatened war and that the Zulu kingdom would secede and all that sort of stuff, ANC president went down there to give assurances, and personally I don't think that was wise. I think that he didn't need to go there himself. He could have sent a message that there's nothing in our statements and in our policies which relate to your powers, your legitimate legal powers as the king of the Zulu people. Whether those powers extend to all of what's in the Ingonyama Trust is not part of the debate about expropriation. It's a separate debate, but it needs to be debated. But by going down there like that, he said that we are not going to trust Ingonyama Trust. Now, we're not going to touch Ingonyama Trust. Now, why did he say that when people are paying money for leasing, which they ought not to be paying? I can't understand why he did that, where he got the mandate from.
And lastly, Raymond, we know that Contralesa is also expecting for the ANC to do almost the same as they've responded to the Zulu King. Are we likely to see something like that?
It's interesting that the EFF also met with them, and it's not clear whether they are also going along with this. I don't know how strong Contralesa is. I should have said one other thing. The ANC operates with the idea from the beginning that when you recruit a chief to the ANC, you bring the whole tribe or chiefdom with them. Now, I think that's been a fiction for a long time. Now, when Mandela and Sisulu and them came out of jail, they also had this idea that we must mend the bridges with the kings and the chiefs, unlike the 1980s when there was a lot of contestation with them. And that's what, and their reasoning was, let's isolate the apartheid regime. But I think people have the illusion that if you bring in Stella Sikau or someone like that from the royal family into the ANC, that the whole of the she was Amampondo. All of the Amampondo will follow. Now, it's not the case. It depends on the particular chief. Sometimes they can't stand the person. Sometimes they will follow that person. It depends on the record. People in the rural areas are not stupid. They don't just follow like sheep. And the ANC thinks that by wooing the chiefs, they're going to get more votes. The people on the ground are not that dumb. You know, they have an idea of what's in their interest. I'm not saying chiefs must go or anything like that. I'm saying you need to look at each case by case.
Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about traditional leaders and land.